After the success of the original Stormbreaker, PWNAGE has released a new version of the Stormbreaker called the Platinum version, which is an updated model that has a bunch of quality of life fixes as well as some improvements to the design of the original Stormbreaker. Now, I did review the OG Stormbreaker a couple months ago, and while that mouse was overall a decent mouse, it did have several shortfalls and QC issues that made that unit very hard to recommend. In my review, I made a list of things I'd like to see fixed and or improved on a future version of the Stormbreaker, and turns out that PWNAGE has fixed pretty much every single thing on that list here on the Platinum edition of the Stormbreaker. So today we're going to take an in-depth dive into the brand new PWNAGE Stormbreaker and see what PWNAGE has done to improve the design of this mouse and what else has changed on the new version. Now, before we get into the review, I did want to say a big thank you to PWNAGE, who was kind enough to send out the Stormbreaker for review. As always, this video will be fully subtitled and timestamps available down in the description if you're looking for a particular topic. And if you enjoy the review of the new Stormbreaker and want to see more reviews like this as well as a full teardown of the updated Stormbreaker, be sure to leave a like on this video and get subscribed. Now, just to clarify, the upgraded version of the Stormbreaker is referred to as the Platinum Stormbreaker. All of the improvements that have been added to the Platinum version are going to be applied to all future Stormbreaker releases, as well as the BLG edition that I have here today, which is just the Platinum Stormbreaker with a new colorway. Now, since the BLG Stormbreaker I have here today is just a recolored Platinum edition and has all the changes of the second generation version of the Stormbreaker, just to keep things simple, I'm going to be referring to this model, the BLG version, and the Platinum version as the Stormbreaker V2, and the original Stormbreaker as the Stormbreaker V1, just to keep things simple. Alright, well, with all that out of the way, let's go ahead and get right into it. First, we're going to talk about the in-game performance of the brand new Stormbreaker, and then we'll talk about all the other improvements here that PWNAGE has implemented on this Stormbreaker V2. Alright, now when it comes to the in-game performance of the Stormbreaker V2, the V2 maintains the unique performance with its adjustable sensor that we found on the Stormbreaker V1. This is an awesome and heavily underrated feature that heavily impacts the gaming experience here on the Stormbreaker mice. The adjustable sensor gives the Stormbreaker V2 some incredibly unique performance that, with some tuning, matches your aim style, allowing for a natural aiming experience that isn't impacted by a non-aligned sensor positioning like you commonly find on other mice. I'll talk more about the effects of this adjustable sensor and how to best utilize it later on in this video, but for now, in regard to the in-game performance here in the Stormbreaker V2, just know this adjustable sensor makes the V2 perform in a league of its own compared to a lot of the other mice on the market. The shell shape and the material of the Stormbreaker V2 is the same as it was on the V1. It's the same magnesium ergo shape that feels similar to a smaller Death Adder V3. I love the shape of the V1, so I'm very happy to see the same shape here on the V2 version of the Stormbreaker. There have also been a lot of other improvements to the V2. The overall build quality of the mouse has improved significantly. The main buttons are much better stabilized and don't wobble like they did on the V1. The side buttons have been vastly improved, so much so that they're actually significantly easier to actuate and they're actually usable in game, which is great to see. There are also a lot of other improvements here on the V2, but I'll talk more about those later on in this video. But despite all these improvements here on the V2, it still does have some issues. The battery life is rather disappointing compared to other flagship mice, and the coating on the BLG edition specifically is rather disappointing, and the stock skates are still the same unbalanced stocks we saw in the V1, which is disappointing to see, but I'll talk more in depth about these shortfalls later on in this video. But overall, the Stormbreaker V2 is a massive improvement from the original V1 Stormbreaker. There are of course still some small issues, but the overall experience here on the V2 is significantly better than it was in the V1. Again, I can't emphasize enough just how amazing this adjustable sensor feature is. It genuinely makes a massive difference in the V2's performance and makes this mouse perform on a league of its own compared to a lot of the other flagship mice available on the market. Alrighty, let's talk about unboxing next. The Stormbreaker V2's box is the same as the boxes we saw in the V1. Inside the box, the first thing we have is the Stormbreaker V2 itself. Underneath that, we have a USB-C pyramid dongle. This is the same shape and dimensions as the previous dongle we found with the Stormbreaker V1, just with a new paint job to match the Platinum colorway. We also have a full paper user manual included, which is awesome to see. We also have a USB A to C cable that is much thinner than the cable that came with the V1. It also has little rubber caps on both ends, which is a great attention to detail. And we also have a little dual-sided screwdriver that was included with the V1, which I'm very happy to see included here with the V2. This screwdriver makes it very easy to adjust the sensor on the go, but also makes the entire unit very serviceable, which is great to see. And then lastly, we have what is, in my opinion, the biggest change here with the included accessories for the V2 is we have some new grip tape. We have one set of pre-cut grips and we have an extra little universal kit. The material of the grips has changed significantly from the ones included with the V1, but I'll talk more about these new grips later on in this video. Overall, the unboxing experience here for the Stormbreaker V2 has improved significantly from the V1. While both models use the same packaging design, the included accessories here on the V2 are much better than what was included with the V1, and it gives the overall unboxing experience here for the V2 a much more premium feeling, which is great to see. Alright, let's talk build quality and QC next. Now, the V1 Stormbreaker had a lot of issues with the build quality and QC. The main clicks were very wobbly, and that unit had a lot of creaking and flexing where the upper magnesium shell met the plastic base, but as I mentioned earlier, the V2 has improved significantly in terms of build quality and QC, but it is unfortunately still not perfect. The V2 shell composition is still the same as the V1, where the upper shell is magnesium and the bottom is plastic, but the upper magnesium frame and the plastic base have been adjusted so their tolerances are much tighter, largely eliminating that flexing and creaking issue we have with the V1. Now I will say the V2 will still creak and flex if you death grip the sides of the mouse, but it won't do so when normally gripping the mouse, largely eliminating that creaking issue we had on the V1, which is great to see. The base of the V2 has also been improved, where the plastic base shell is slightly thicker than it was on the V1, so it doesn't flex or bow out as easily as the base on the V1 did, which is great to see. The V2's main clicks have also been massively improved as they're significantly better stabilized than they were on the V1. For whatever reason, the main clicks on my V1 Stormbreaker shifted like crazy, so much so that it actually moved around when I was moving the mouse, giving the main clicks kind of this disjointed feeling from the rest of the Stormbreaker V1. But the clicks here on the Stormbreaker V2 are significantly better stabilized than they were on the V1 and has completely eliminated that disjointed loose feeling I had on the V1, which is a great thing to see. But as I mentioned earlier, the V2 isn't perfect. For some reason, the rear part of the shell has this weird flex on the upper right corner where it meets the main clicks, kind of at the midline of the mouse. I didn't have this issue on the V1, so I'm kind of confused on why this issue is here on the V2. Now, I will say this only pops when direct pressure is applied to it, and it isn't noticeable during normal use at all. So this issue, in my opinion, is largely cosmetic, but disappointing to see nonetheless on a more premium version of the Stormbreaker. But aside from that odd spot on the top shell, the Stormbreaker V2 is a massive improvement across the board from the V1. The unit feels significantly better built and much more premium than the V1 did. The only exception to this is that odd spot of the top shell, but again, this is purely cosmetic and doesn't affect the actual usage of the Stormbreaker here at all. Alright, let's talk about weight next. Now, just like Ponage said on the Stormbreaker V1, the V2 is advertised as weighing in around 50 grams. There's no mention of a plus-minus gram ratio on Ponage's website, so I assume it's going to be using the standard plus-minus 2 grams. Now, weighing in my Stormbreaker V2 with the stock skates installed, my unit is weighing in at 51.67 grams, which is a little over the advertised weight spec, but just under a plus-minus 2 gram ratio on a 50 gram weight. For the Stormbreaker being a magnesium ergo mouse, the 51.6 gram weight is quite good. I do wish it was lighter, maybe more around the 45 gram range, but the weight here is fine on the V2. I don't really have any major complaints. It's also worth noting that Ponage was able to keep the weight between the V1 and the V2 Stormbreaker pretty much the same, even with all the V2's improvements, which is quite impressive, so props to Ponage for that. Alright, let's talk about the Stormbreaker V2 stock skates next. The V2 stock skates are the same skates we saw in the V1, having these 4 oddly sized, chip-shaped 100% PTFE stock skates. Now, this is one area I was really hoping we were going to see some improvements from Ponage, as the stock skates here on the V2, which performed okay, aren't balanced in terms of their surface area. As someone who uses dot skates and donut skates all the time, I'm very sensitive to unbalanced stocks, and the stock skates here on the V2 are unbalanced, just like they were on the V1. I was really hoping we were going to see some balanced skates here in the V2, but unfortunately not. Another shortfall of the V2 is that just like the V1, the V2 does not have any skate removal ramps on the base of the unit, so removing these unbalanced stock skates is quite difficult, and it's very easy to scratch the plastic base of the Stormbreaker V2 if you're not careful. Now, on the plus side, Ponage does at least include an extra set of the stock skates in the box, but for me, they're just not skates I'm going to use as they're unbalanced. I ended up removing the stock skates and installing the X-Ray Pad Obsidian Air dots instead, as I preferred the more balanced feeling of the dots over the unbalanced stock skates. But overall, in regards to the V2 stock skates, I am very disappointed to see that the V2 still has the same unbalanced stock skates and the lack of removal ramps that the V1 did. I hope that Ponage can find some way to balance out these stock skates in the future and also include skate removal ramps on the bottom of the Stormbreaker. Those would be changes I would love to see on the next iteration of the Stormbreaker. Alright, let's talk connectivity on the Stormbreaker V2 next. Just like the V1, the V2 only has 2 connectivity methods, wired USB-C and 2.4 GHz wireless. Sadly, like the Stormbreaker V1, the V2 can only use 125 Hz to 1000 Hz over the wired connectivity, but unlike the V1, the V2 does have 4K polling, so you can utilize 125 Hz to 4000 Hz over the wireless connectivity, which is a nice improvement from the V1. I'll talk more about the high polling rate implementation later on in this review. Now, while the wired USB-C usage doesn't support high polling rates, the wire usage as a whole has been significantly improved compared to the V1, as the V2 stock cable is much thinner and much more flexible than the V1 stock cable. I'll talk more about the cable in a moment. Overall, the connectivity methods here on the V2 are well implemented. I would love to see a future iteration of the Stormbreaker that has support for 8K wireless and wired polling, but that'll be a conversation for a future version of the Stormbreaker. The current Stormbreaker V2's wireless and wired connectivity methods are very well implemented, no real complaints complaints from my side. Alright, let's talk about the Stormbreaker V2 stock cable next. As I just mentioned, the cable here on the V2 is significantly better than the one that was included with the Stormbreaker V1. The new cable is much thinner and much more flexible than the V1's cable, which makes wired usage here on the V2 significantly better than it was on the V1. Now, I was a little concerned at first that the V2 stock cable would be too thin to be used with bungees, but it turns out that the V2 stock cable is just thick enough where it's still usable with bungees and doesn't slip out during use, which is great to see. But one disappointing thing about the V2 stock cable is that just like the V1 stock cable, it isn't tilted on the USB-C end. Now, admittedly, this isn't that big of an issue since the V2 can only use 1K pulling over the wired connectivity, so the cable is only going to be used for charging mainly, and this being non-tilted isn't that big of an issue. But on a future version of the Stormbreaker, one that would support high pulling rates over the wired connectivity, a stock cable with a tilted USB-C end would be a necessity. If Ponage were to include the same stock cable we see here on the V2 with a tilted USB-C end on a future version of the Stormbreaker, it would be a perfect implementation. But in regards to the V2 stock cable, it is a significant improvement over the V1 stock cable, which is great to see. My only issue with it is I wish the USB-C end was tilted, but it's a very minimal complaint. Alright, let's talk about the Stormbreaker V2 shape next. The shape of the V2 is unchanged from the Stormbreaker V1. It is the same right-handed ergonomic shape that's similar to the Razer Death Adder V3, just slightly smaller. The V2 shell is measuring in at 122mm long, 64mm wide, and 42mm tall. Looking at the Stormbreaker V2 from the side, we can see the profile of the shell as it is centrally focused, as it was on the previous Stormbreaker. The mouse's shell peaks towards the middle of the mouse, the front half of the shell gently slopes forward, and the rear shell hump is that long gradual hump that we commonly see on ergo mice. Looking from the front, we can see the heavy ergonomic tilt to the V2 shell. We can also see that the sides of the V2 are slightly rounded towards the bottom of the shell, but flatten out as you go up the sides of the Stormbreaker V2 shell. Looking at the V2 from the back, we can see that tilted long gradual hump profile I mentioned earlier, but from the back we can get a better view at the hump shape, which is kind of a hybridization between a rounded egg-like hump where it's taller but also semi-egg-like shape in its overall curvature. Overall, the shape execution here on the V2 is fantastic. I love the shape of the original Stormbreaker, and seeing the exact same shape here on the Stormbreaker V2 is awesome to see. I'll talk about how it feels in the hand in a moment, but overall the shell is fantastic. It's one of the more comfortable ergo shapes I've tried this year. Alright, let's talk about contact areas and grip compatibility for the Stormbreaker V2 next. Since the Stormbreaker V2 is an ergo mouse, my preferred mouse shape, with my 1905 by 12.7cm hands, the Stormbreaker V2 is very comfortable with a natural claw grip. In terms of contact areas, the Stormbreaker V2 makes most of its contact in the mid to high hypothenar, mid to high mid palm, and lower to mid thenar region of my hands. For larger handed folk like myself, the contact areas here on the V2 are going to be pretty similar, but for smaller hands there will be more of a reliance on a hypothenar and mid palm contact than there will be on thenar contact. But keep in mind this will vary depending on your hand size and the grip style you're using here on the Stormbreaker V2. Now, speaking of other hand sizes and grip styles, from my estimations the Stormbreaker V2 will be best suited for small hands, probably going to be a palm grip mouse. For small to medium, palm grip again. For medium sized hands, I'd probably say palm grip and claw grip. For medium to large hands, palm and claw grip again. And for large hands, palm and claw again. Now keep in mind you can fingertip grip the Stormbreaker V2, but only with medium to large and large hands. But since the shape is an ergo mouse, it's not exactly the most comfortable for fingertip grip. Still usable, but not necessarily recommended. Overall though, for being an ergo mouse and a slightly smaller one at that, the hand to grip size compatibility here on the Stormbreaker V2 is quite good, better than you see on most of the larger ergo mice you see out on the market. Alright, let's talk about the Stormbreaker V2's coating next. Now the BLG edition I have here today is a little different from the other V2s, as this version is painted with the BLG team colors. Normally the Platinum and the other V2s will have the same raw magnesium coating that we saw on the original Stormbreaker, having that metallic fine sandpaper-like grittiness to it, but since the BLG edition is painted, the natural coating is going to be covered up, so the BLG edition is going to feel very different from the other V2 colorways in terms of its coating. The painted shell here on the BLG edition gives the shell a glossy feeling, similar to the feeling of your finger rubbing up against the sides of a car. And since the fine sandpaper-like grittiness of the V2's natural coating is covered by this glossy paint, the BLG shell will feel decently grippy for dry hands, but once there is a slight bit of moisture to your hands or fingers, the shell becomes extremely slippery. Now on the non-colored versions of the Stormbreaker, you were able to kind of anchor your fingers onto the sides of the Stormbreaker shell by pushing into the shell and forcing your skin into the gaps on the side of the shell, giving yourself a little bit of extra anchoring. But since the BLG edition I have here is painted, the shell's coating is much thicker, making it much harder to push your skin into the gaps on the sides of the shell, removing that extra little bit of anchoring you could utilize has on the non-painted editions of the Stormbreaker. Now, in fairness to Ponage, the non-BLG edition Stormbreaker shells are still very slippery, and even on the V1 I previously covered, I still recommended using grip tape to make them as grippier as the shell was quite slippery. The same is going to go here for the V2 and especially the BLG editions, as the coatings are very slippery on both the painted and non-painted versions. Now, Ponage was obviously aware of the issues with the shell grippiness on the V2 and the BLG edition, so they have included new grip tape here with the V2 edition and the BLG edition that is a significant improvement over the grip tape that came with the V1, but I'll talk more about those in a moment. But overall, the BLG's coating is definitely a downgrade from the natural coating available on the other V2's colorways, but even those versions are still rather subpar in terms of their gripability due to the magnesium shell material. You will 100% need to rely on grip tape here on the BLG/V2 editions of the Stormbreaker, which is disappointing to see. I was hoping we'd see some improvements in the coating here on the V2 versions, but it looks like we're going to be waiting a little longer for some coating improvements here on the Stormbreaker. Now, as I just mentioned when I was talking about the coating, you will 100% need to rely on grip tape to use the Ponage Stormbreaker V2 and the BLG editions, just because the coating is so slippery, and because of this, Ponage has included a new type of grip tape here with the V2 and the BLG edition that is significantly better than the coatings we saw with the V1, so let's talk about the V2's grips next. Now, as I mentioned earlier in the unboxing section of this review, the V2 comes with 2 sheets of these new grip tapes, a pre-cut set and a small universal set, which is great to see. I wish more brands would include a small set of universal kits with their mice because it makes covering the rear hump of the shell very easy. Now, the included grips are black, which is a good thing as color grip tape will discolor very quickly. Now, the texturing on these new grips with the V2 edition are very different from the texturing of the V1 grips, which have a raised kind of zigzag-like texturing to them. The V2 grips here are a flat skin-like texturing, very similar to the texturing we found on the X-Ray Pad Cicada Wing 2.0s. Funnily enough, the V2's grips are also very similar in thickness to the Cicada Wing 2.0s, being around 0.22 millimeters in terms of their thickness. The V2's grips have a great natural stickiness to them, and the grips remain sticky with both wet and dry hands. The V2's grips also maintain their stickiness over time, something that the V1's grips had issues with as they dried out over time and became less sticky the longer they were on the mouse. The V2's grips do not have this issue and remain sticky and very grippy across all of my testing. Now, while these upgraded grips on the V2 are fantastic, they do have 2 downsides. Firstly, due to the thickness, they do prevent the ability for you to press into the V2 shell by pushing your skin into the gaps in the shell. Now, this isn't an issue on the BLG edition since the coating prevents this, but on the other editions of the V2, this will be a bit of a downside. The second downside to the grips is that because the grips are so thin, the gaps in the actual Stormbreaker shell will show through this grip tape, so you can't use the grip tape to make the side of the mouse completely flat, which may be a bit of a deal breaker for some people. Again, a pretty minimal issue, but something I wanted to mention regardless. But overall, the new grips included with the Stormbreaker V2 are fantastic. I swear these are clones of the Cicada Wing 2.0s, or they are Cicada Wing 2.0s because they perform so similar to each other, but the included grips are very good and they perform extremely well across the board. The extra included set of universal pieces also helps to fix an issue I had with the previous Stormbreaker, where the palm area of the Stormbreaker V1 would feel very slippery as it didn't come with any additional covers. It only came with the pre-cut set that didn't cover the back of the mouse. So having the extra universal kit here with the V2 to help cover the back of the mouse to increase the mouse's overall gripability is awesome to see. The grip tape that's included here with the Ponage Stormbreaker V2 is easily the best set of grips I've ever seen included with the mouse because they're basically 1-for-1 with the Cicada Wings, which is an aftermarket set. So props to Ponage, they've done a fantastic job with these included grips. Alright, let's talk about the Stormbreaker V2's main clicks next. As I mentioned earlier, the main clicks here in the V2 is one area where this mouse has massively improved over the V1 Stormbreaker. The shell clicks have a slight finger groove in them that run from the end of the button to around the midway point of the main clicks. The indentation is very slight, but it's deep enough to keep your fingers centrally positioned in the shell buttons, which is great to see. The V2 shell buttons are the same magnesium material as the rest of the V2's upper shell, and they share the same glossy painted coating as the rest of the V2 shell. I'll give you a quick little sound test of the main clicks here. The Stormbreaker V2 is using my beloved mel0n optical switches for the mate buttons, the same switches that the V1 was using. I absolutely love the feeling of the mel0ns we saw in the V1, and I'm very happy to see them return here on the V2. It's also worth noting that the mel0n switches on the V2 are binned just like they were on the V1, so the main switch's quality will be slightly more reliable than the non-binned mel0n switches you'll see on other mice. In terms of the V2's main clicks actuation weight, it's around a 4.5 out of 10. The main clicks have a slight bit of pre-travel and a tiny little bit of post-travel, but they have a very snappy rebound, so the V2's main buttons feel very snappy and very spammable. The V2's main clicks also feel consistent in terms of their actuation weight and their pre and post travel across the entire shell buttons, which is great to see. And as I mentioned earlier, the stabilization of the main clicks is significantly better than it was on the V1. I don't have that weird disjointed wobbling issue I had on the V1. The main clicks here on the V2 are very well stabilized and feel fantastic. But there is one thing I am a little disappointed to see here on the V2, and that is that the main shell buttons are still not indented into the shell. Now, thankfully, because the Stormbreaker is an ergo mouse, the sides of the mouse are all taller than they be on like a symmetrical mouse, so I didn't have any issues with my fingers interfering with the actuation of the main clicks from my testing. But with smaller hand sizes and different grip styles, this may be a bit of an issue. I really hope on future versions of the Stormbreaker we'll see these clicks indented into the shell, as this would eliminate any potential of your fingers interfering with the actuation of the main clicks entirely. But aside from the possible issues with the non-indented main clicks with some hand sizes, the main clicks here on the V2 are a significant improvement over the clicks on the V1, and the V2's main buttons are easily one of the better main click implementations I've used this year. These mel0n switches just feel so crispy, and combined with the magnesium shell of the mouse, these just feel incredibly consistent and very solid. Again, easily one of the best main click implementations I've used this year. Alright, let's talk about the Stormbreaker V2's side buttons next. Similar to the V2's main clicks, the side clicks is another area where there have been a lot of improvements here on the V2 edition of the Stormbreaker. Now, the side buttons on the V1 were ridiculously high in terms of their actuation weight, so much so that they actually weren't usable at all. But here on the V2, the side button actuation weight has been significantly decreased. The switch has also been changed, which has made the side buttons on the V2 significantly more usable than the ones on the V1. Now, the physical shape of the side buttons here on the V2 is the same as the V1, being these chip-like side buttons that have a large surface area with a slight edge to them. The Stormbreaker side buttons are similar to the Death Adder V3's side buttons, just shrunk down a little bit. I really like the side buttons of the Death Adder V3, so I'm very happy to see a similar side button shape here on the V2 of the Stormbreaker. Now, the side buttons on the V2 are plastic just like they were on the V1, and they are using the same shell coating as the rest of the V2's shell. The side buttons are centrally positioned to the shell, but they're quite high up in the side of the Stormbreaker shell. They're also balanced in terms of their positioning, so they're not tilting towards the front or the back of the mouse at all. I'll give you a quick little sound test of the side buttons here. Now, the V1 Stormbreaker was using mel0n white dots micro switches for these side buttons, and the V2 is using a new switch, the mel0n blue dot micro switch. These blue switch side buttons are significantly weaker in terms of their actuation force than the white dots was, which helps make the V2 side buttons feel much easier to actuate than the ones on the V1. In terms of actuation force, the side buttons feel like a 4.5 out of 10, more akin to the actuation weight of the Death Adder V3 side buttons. The side buttons have a tiny amount of pre-travel and a little bit of post-travel, but just like the main clicks, the side clicks have a fantastic snappy rebound, and the side buttons are very spammable. The side buttons are also very well stabilized, and the actuation feels consistent across both the side buttons on all angles. Overall, the side buttons feel fantastic, significantly better than the side buttons we found on the Stormbreaker V1. The only issue you might experience here with the side buttons on the V2 is that due to their higher position in the V2 shell, they may be difficult to actuate for some hand sizes and some grip styles. From my testing, I had no issues actuating the forward or back side buttons at all, but you may have some issues depending on your hand size. But overall, the V2 side buttons are a massive improvement from the V1 side buttons. The side buttons were the second biggest issue I had with the V1 Stormbreaker, the first being the main clicks, of course, and having both the main clicks and the side clicks being so significantly improved on the V2 here is awesome to see, and the overall implementation of the Stormbreaker V2 side buttons is perfect. Alright, let's talk about the Stormbreaker V2's scroll wheel next. Now, the V2 is using the same scroll wheel as the V1 did, it's just been recolored to a platinum silver instead of the black we saw on the V1. Now, the scroll wheel is still that hard plastic with the crescent-like texturing that does make the scroll wheel surprisingly grippable for not being made of a softer rubber like we've seen on other scroll wheels. Inside, the V2 is using the same encoder as the V1, using a TTC 13mm encoder. The scroll wheel scroll force is around a 5.5 out of 10 with very pronounced scroll points from this 13mm encoder. In terms of the scroll wheel click, the V2 is again using the same switch as the V1 in this KO pillar switch. The scroll wheel click's actuation force is around a 5 out of 10, definitely on the lighter end for a scroll wheel click, which I actually quite like. The scroll wheel click has a medium amount of pre and post travel, and due to the pillar switch, the scroll wheel does have a weak rebound compared to the main and side buttons. Now, the great thing about the V2 scroll wheel is that due to the scroll wheel's encoder being so pronounced, when you go to scroll wheel click, you don't have any issues with misactuating the wheel, which is fantastic to see. We've had a lot of mice lately have that issue, so I'm very happy to not see that issue here on the Stormbreaker. But overall, the Stormbreaker V2 scroll wheel is very well implemented. The only issue you might have with the scroll wheel is the slightly louder than usual audio feedback you'll get from the scroll wheel. I'll give you a quick little sound test of the scroll wheel here. Now, the audio feedback from the V2 scroll wheel isn't going to be nearly as bad as the audio feedback you hear on like a Vaxi or a Zowie scroll wheel, but I thought it was still worth mentioning as it is louder than a lot of other scroll wheels on the market. But overall, the V2 scroll wheel is fantastically implemented. We had pretty much the same scroll wheel implementation on the V1, which I really liked, and having pretty much the exact same implementation here on the V2 is awesome to see. This is easily one of the best scroll wheel implementations I've used this year, and I wish more flagship mice would use a more pronounced encoder like the TTC 13mm encoder, as it makes the overall scroll wheel experience significantly better. Alright, now I also wanted to briefly talk about the sensor and the MCU here on the Stormbreaker V2. As it turns out, the V2 is using the exact same sensor and MCU that the V1 was using, so we have the same bread and butter combo of the Pixar 3395 DMT6QU and the Nordic 52840 MCU here on the Stormbreaker V2. Now, the 3395 here on the Stormbreaker V2 is a stock 3395 with a max DPI of 26K, two LOD levels of 1mm and 2mm. The sensor does have motion sync, but there is no ripple or angle snapping available on the sensor, and the Nordic 52840 MCU is the standard implementation we normally see on the 3395 and 52840 combo. I'll talk more about the pulling rate ranges and the overall implementation more in a little bit. Now, one of the biggest selling points of the Stormbreakers, aside from their adjustable sensor tech, is the extremely low click latency available on these mice. Now, unfortunately, since I don't have an LDAT or any way to verify these latency claims that Ponage is making here for the Stormbreaker, I can't really talk about this. If you do want to learn more about the click latency available on the Stormbreaker lineup, though, you can check out Ponage's product page, which does link to several third-party testers who have covered the click latency more in depth with proper testing methodology. But overall, the sensor and MCU implementation here on the Stormbreaker V2 is pretty much perfectly implemented. Again, this is a very normal bread and butter combo of the 3395 and the 52840 MCU. This is pretty much perfected at this point, but it's nice to see that there's no executional issues at all here on the Stormbreaker V2. Overall, very good implementation as we normally see. Alright, now while we're on the topic of the sensor, I did want to dive into a little more detail about this adjustable sensor tech here on the Stormbreaker, as this is my favorite feature on all the Stormbreaker mice. Now, one immediate improvement you'll notice here on the V2 Stormbreaker is that Ponage has added little guides onto the side of the V2's adjustable sensor. This is a feature I wanted Ponage to add after I tested the V1, as it was very difficult to return the sensor to stock position or to a position you like the feeling of it on, as there was nothing to guide it off of. So here on the V2, we have this small little guide etched into the base of the shell that you can use to better set the positioning of the Stormbreaker V2's adjustable sensor, or help return the sensor to its stock position, which is a fantastic upgrade to see here on the V2. Now, as I mentioned earlier when I talked about the in-game performance, the adjustable sensor gives the Stormbreaker mice the most unique aiming experience I've ever felt on a mouse. The ability to essentially match the sensor positioning to your aim style on a 1-for-1 is an incredible feature that generally makes a massive difference in the V2's overall performance. Now, depending on your aim style, you can put this sensor higher into the shell to be more compatible with a wrist aim, or you can put it lower to be more compatible with arm aim. Personally speaking, as a hybrid aimer, I like to put the sensor about 3 to 4 millimeters up in the shell, as that matched my personal aim style the best, but you can play around and experiment with the different positionings and find what sensor position works best for your aim style. But overall, the adjustable sensor here in the Stormbreaker V2 is an amazing feature that I'm very happy to see return from the V1. As I've said multiple times in this review, the adjustable sensor genuinely makes the Stormbreaker one of the best performing mice I've tested in 2024, and the ability to match the sensor positioning to your natural aim style on a 1-for-1 basis is an incredible feature. I really hope we see the same feature return on Ponage's future mice, but we'll have to wait and see. Alright, let's talk about the high pulling rate implementation here on the V2 next. As I mentioned earlier, the V2 has 125Hz to 1000Hz on the wired connectivity, and on wireless has 125Hz to 4000Hz on the wireless connectivity. The high pulling rate experience here on the V2 is pretty much exactly the same as it was on the V1, just of course with the added benefit of having 4K polling, and just like the high polling rate performance we saw on the V1, the high polling rate performance on the V2 was flawless across the board, very well implemented. As I mentioned earlier, it would have been nice to see 4K polling available on the wired connectivity here on the V2, but that is something I hopefully Ponage can add onto a future version of the Stormbreaker. But for now, the 1K wired and 4K wireless is perfectly implemented here in the V2. No complaints, it is just a very solid implementation of the high polling rates. Alrighty, let's talk about battery life next. Now, the V1's battery life was a little underwhelming for a flagship mouse, lasting only 55 hours on 1K polling and around 42.7 hours on 2K polling. I was hoping there was going to be some big improvements in terms of the battery life here on the V2, V2, but sadly the battery life on the V2 here is just as underwhelming as it was in the V1. According to PWNAGE's advertisements and product pages for the Stormbreaker, they're advertising that the mouse is going to last around 124 hours for general use and around 60 hours for gaming, but it doesn't specify what polling rate was measured on this for this battery data. I'm just going to assume it's 1K polling. Now initially I thought the battery here on the V2 was going to be significantly worse than the V1 because based on my initial calculations, the V2 battery was estimated to only last 18.3 hours on 1K polling, even though both the V1 and the V2 you were using the same 300 mAh battery, which definitely raised some red flags on my end, and it turns out that for whatever reason, the PWNAGE software is reporting the wrong battery level. So the software was reporting some abysmal battery numbers here, but the actual battery life for the Stormbreaker V2 was much better than the software was reporting. Now, since the PWNAGE software wasn't reporting the right battery levels here with the V2, I wasn't able to really properly test the battery life, but I can say that on 4K polling and the auto sleep set to 5 minutes, the V2 lasted around 19 hours. Using that to roughly estimate the usage on 2 and 1K polling, I'd estimate that the V2 is probably going to have around 30 to 35 hours on 2K polling, and on 1K polling the battery life is going to be probably similar to the V1, being around 55 hours. Just keep in mind these are very rough estimates, so your results may vary. Now, aside from the issues with the software reporting the wrong battery life, another issue that hasn't still been patched coming from the V1 is the battery cables, which are still colored. Now this really bothers me as PWNAGE took the time to black out the rest of the V1 and the V2's PCBs, but left these colored battery cables that stick out like a sore thumb. Now admittedly, they're difficult to notice, but once you do notice them, you can't unsee them. I really hope that future PWNAGE mice will have blacked out battery cables, as these colored battery cables stand out like a sore thumb here on the Stormbreaker mice. Now my last kind of gripe here with the battery life here in the Stormbreaker V2 is the overall battery life itself. While yes, it is similar to the battery life we experienced on the Stormbreaker V1, for this being a 300 mAh battery compared to other flagship mice that are also using 300 mAh batteries, it's quite low. There have been other mice I've covered here on the channel like the Sprime PM1 and the Nujutsu Sora V2 that are using a 250 mAh battery that have 80 hours on 1K polling. So this is one area that PWNAGE does need to do a little bit of work on here with the Stormbreaker lineup, as the battery optimizations are quite poor. Again, there's no reason why a mouse with a 250 mAh battery should be able to outlast a 300 mAh battery. That just should not be possible, but it is here just because the Stormbreaker is very poorly optimized. Again, the battery life isn't like atrociously bad, but it is very bad comparing it to a lot of the other flagship mice on the market, which is very disappointing. Hopefully PWNAGE can release some firmware patches for the Stormbreaker to kind of patch or increase its battery life a little bit with some better optimizations, but we'll have to wait and see if they end up doing so. Alrighty, and last I wanted to briefly talk about repairability and serviceability here on the Stormbreaker V2. Now the V1 Stormbreaker was a surprisingly serviceable unit, and the same goes here with the V2, where it is actually very easy to service. Taking the unit apart can be a little tricky because you do need to remove the 2 base gates to get access to the access screws on the bottom of the unit, and as I mentioned earlier, this is a little difficult because there's no skate removal ramp, so getting these skates off can be a little difficult, but once you get them off and you take out the 2 screws on the bottom of the mouse is very easy to take apart, open, and service. Easy to clean too, which is great to see for a mouse like this because it is an open shell, so it's going to fill up with dust and pet hair and that kind of stuff over time. The only tricky part about the serviceability here is that getting the unit back together can be a little tricky because the ribbon cable for the side button PCB is very short. Now there is a bit of a workaround for this to actually put the mouse together and kind of go around this short cable, but I'll talk more about that in my teardown of the Stormbreaker V2. They'll be coming out in a couple days. But overall, the Stormbreaker V2, just like the V1, is a very serviceable unit, which is fantastic to see. I really love how a lot of Stormbreaker's mice are very, very serviceable. Hopefully that'll be continuing on their future mice, but at least for right now in the Stormbreakers, they are very, very easy to service. Alright, well in closing, overall the Stormbreaker V2 is a massive improvement over the prior Stormbreaker models, but it is still flawed in some ways. The V2's battery life is still disappointing compared to other flagship mice using 300 mAh batteries. The coating on the BLG edition specifically is a massive downgrade from the coatings on the Platinum and the other colorways, which to be fair are also pretty underwhelming regardless. The stock skates are still unbalanced and the lack of skate removal ramps is very disappointing, and the battery cables here on the Stormbreaker still not being blacked out and being colored make them stand out like a sore thumb on this mouse, which is very disappointing to see. But that said, the V2 does have significantly fewer glaring issues than the V1 had. The V2's improvement to the overall build quality, the flawless main click, side click, and scroll wheel implementations. The included grip tape is a massive improvement over the grip tape we saw with the V1 and helps save the BLG edition specifically from being too slippery, which is great to see. And of course, the fantastic overall performance, the great click latency, and the adjustable sensor is a massively underrated feature that makes the Stormbreaker V2 perform unlike anything else on the market right now. I absolutely love the adjustable sensor feature on the Stormbreaker V1, but that mouse just had way too many issues for me to actually main that mouse. The performance was amazing, but the mouse was just flawed and just was not a mouse I could actually use on a day-to-day basis. But the Stormbreaker V2, while still not being perfect, is a significantly better mouse than the V1, and the Stormbreaker V2 is actually a mouse I'm going to be maining for the foreseeable future. This adjustable sensor tech is just too good not to use and is well worth dealing with the few slight shortfalls here in the Stormbreaker V2. I would love to see PWNAGE release a V3 of the Stormbreaker in the near future that addresses some of the issues I do have with the V2, while of course adding some additional performance features like high polling rates over the wired USB-C connectivity and maybe 8K polling, but who really knows what's going on behind closed doors at PWNAGE, and who knows what they're working on next. But that's going to be everything for this episode of the mel0n review. Thank you very much for watching. Big thank you again to PWNAGE, who was kind enough to send over the Stormbreaker V2 for review. I greatly appreciate it. If you enjoyed the review, be sure to leave a like and get subscribed so you don't miss any future reviews. I will also have a full teardown of the Stormbreaker V2 coming out in a couple days, so be sure to get subscribed so you don't miss that. Big thank you to our channel members, Yuki89, Prince, It Was Luck, and Lunaris, who help keep the lights on over here. Your support is greatly appreciated. If you'd like to become a member here and support what I'm doing with the Teardown Project and all the in-depth reviews here on the channel, you can do so for only $2 a month. It is the best way to directly support the channel, so thank you very much in advance for all your support. You can also support the channel by using code mel0n with a 0 over at Lethal Gaming Gear, Potent Gaming, MetKeys, TJ Exclusives, and a couple other retailers to save yourself some money on your orders and help directly support the channel. Thanks again for watching my review of the PWNAGE Stormbreaker V2, and I'll catch you all in the next episode of the mel0n review. Peace.